My name is Walter Greer. I am 69 years old, and for the past 5 months, I have been the most convincing fool in the state of Tennessee. I burned the scrambled eggs on purpose. I called my son by his dead uncle's name at the dinner table. I stood in the middle of my own driveway one Tuesday morning in October, still wearing my bathrobe, staring at the mailbox like I had forgotten what it was for. My neighbor, Frank, slowed his truck and asked if I needed help. I told him I was fine, just tired. But what I was really doing was waiting to see if my daughter-in-law was watching from the kitchen window. She was. I know because I had a camera mounted in the birdhouse on the fence post, and I watched the footage that night on my laptop, sitting alone in my study with the door locked. She stood at that window for nearly 2 minutes, her coffee mug held in both hands, watching me. And she was smiling. That smile told me everything I needed to know. It confirmed what I had suspected since August. What I had hoped with everything in me was wrong. My daughter-in-law was not worried about me. She was pleased. She was counting on me falling apart. She had no idea that I had never been more clear-headed in my life. Let me back up to where this all started, because none of it makes sense without the beginning. I spent 42 years building Greer Home Supply. It started as a single store on the edge of Knoxville, a family hardware business with 12 employees and a loading dock that flooded every spring. My wife, Carol, kept the books in those early years, working at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, a pencil tucked behind her ear. We grew slowly, then quickly. By the time I sold the company last spring, Greer Home Supply had 27 locations across 5 states, 460 employees, and a reputation that I was prouder of than anything else I had ever built. The buyer was a regional home improvement conglomerate out of Atlanta. They paid $31 million for what Carol and I had built from nothing. Carol had been gone for 3 years by then, pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which is its own kind of cruelty, not enough time to say everything you need to say. She died in April, and I sold the company the following May, and by June, I was a 9-year-old widower with more money than I knew what to do with, and a house that felt twice as large as it used to. My son Thomas, was the one bright thing. He was 40 years old, worked as a civil engineer for a firm in Nashville, and had inherited his mother's patience and her easy laugh. We had always been close. When Carol got sick, he drove down every weekend without being asked. He sat with her, watched old movies with her, held her hand. He was a good man. I want to be clear about that, because what comes next is complicated, and I do not want anyone to mistake what happened for a failure of his character. Thomas met his wife, Nicole, 2 years before Carol died. She was 35, worked in real estate, tall and polished in a way that looked effortless, but probably required a great deal of effort. She had one of those smiles that makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room, while also making you vaguely uneasy. The way a well-lit room in a house with no furniture makes you uneasy. Something about it was too deliberate. Carol had been gracious about Nicole, the way Carol was gracious about everything. But in one of our last real conversations, when she could still sit up in the hospital bed and hold a cup of tea, she said to me, quietly, as if she were telling me something she had been saving, "Walter, keep your eyes open with that one." She did not say anything else about it. I did not press her. I should have. Nicole and Thomas got married 14 months after Carol passed. A small ceremony in Nashville. I walked down the aisle alone, and I smiled because that is what you do. And I held it together until the reception, when a string quartet played the same song Carol and I had danced to at our own wedding. And then I excused myself and stood outside in the parking garage for 6 minutes until I could breathe normally again. I tell you all of this so you understand who I was by the time the trouble started. I was a grieving man, a rich, grieving man, which is its own particular vulnerability. I missed my wife. I missed my company. I was trying to figure out what the second half of my life was supposed to look like without either of them, and I was not paying enough attention. The first sign came in July. 2 months after the sale closed, Thomas and Nicole had come down for a long weekend. We were eating dinner on the back porch, the 3 of us, looking out at the lake, when Nicole set down her fork and said, almost casually, "Dad, have you thought about what you're going to do with the money?" I said I had some people looking into it. She nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone gives you an answer you already expected and had already decided was wrong. "The problem with traditional financial management," she said, "is that it's so conservative. There are opportunities right now, real estate development, commercial properties, that are generating returns that a bank account will never touch." She looked at me with those careful eyes. "I've been working with some investors, people who really understand the market. I think you should at least sit down with them." I said I would think about it. Thomas, to his credit, looked slightly uncomfortable and changed the subject. But I noticed that he did not disagree with her. The following month, Nicole called me directly. Thomas was at work. She wanted to know if I had thought any more about meeting with her investment contacts. She mentioned a figure, a projected annual return, that was almost offensively unrealistic. When I said I wasn't interested, she shifted the conversation smoothly, the way water shifts around a stone, and began asking about my health. "I was fine," I said. "You just seem tired lately," she said. Thomas mentioned, "You forgot about the dinner reservation last month." I had forgotten about that reservation. It had been a genuinely busy week, and it slipped my mind. I said so. "Of course," Nicole said. "I'm sure it's nothing. We just love you and want to make sure you're okay." I hung up the phone and sat very still for a moment. Then I called my attorney. His name is Roy Caldwell. He has been my lawyer for 26 years. He is the kind of man who listens more than he speaks and always returns your calls within the hour. And he was the only person outside of my family who knew the exact size of the settlement from the sale. I told him about both conversations. I told him about the smile through the kitchen window, which had not happened yet, but which I already, somehow, knew was coming. I told him that Carol had warned me. "What do you want me to do?" Roy asked. "Find out everything," I said. Roy was thorough. He was also fast. Within 3 weeks, he came to my house with a folder and a look on his face that was carefully neutral, in the way that only very bad news makes a person look. Nicole's investment contacts were not investors. They were participants in a high-yield fraud scheme that had already drawn scrutiny from the Tennessee Securities Division. 3 separate complaints had been filed in the past 18 months. The returns she had cited to me were fabricated. If I had handed them money, I would have gotten a handsome statement every quarter showing spectacular gains, right up until the moment the whole thing collapsed and everything disappeared. Her brother, a man named Darren, who I had met twice at family events and remembered only as the kind of person who talked too loudly about wine, was a paralegal who had been presenting himself to clients as a licensed attorney for close to 4 years. He specialized, Roy said with deliberate care, in estate planning, specifically in helping families navigate situations where an elderly relative was deemed no longer capable of managing their own financial affairs. I felt the coldness settle into my chest. "Guardianship," I said. Roy nodded once. I thought about Carol's words. "Keep your eyes open with that one." "Does Thomas know?" I asked. Roy hesitated. "I don't know," he said. "There's no evidence he's directly involved. But Nicole's phone records show regular calls with Darren going back over a year. Before you sold the company, she had been planning this before the sale closed. She had been waiting." "And Thomas?" I asked again. "I don't know," Roy said again. "I'm sorry, Walter." I sat with that for a long time. Long enough that Roy refilled my coffee and waited. Here is the thing about being 69 years old and building something for 4 decades. You learn to take the hit and stay standing. You learn that grief and fury are not useful unless you channel them into something that actually changes the outcome. I was furious. I was also frightened in a way that I had not been since the night the Knoxville store flooded, and I stood in 3 inches of water at 2 in the morning, trying to save the inventory with a push broom and a broken pump. But I did not panic then, and I did not panic now. "I want to run a play," I said. Roy looked at me. "What kind of play?" "The kind where they think they're winning until the moment they realize they've already lost." I started performing the following week. The scrambled eggs, the bathrobe in the driveway, the forgotten names, the confused pauses mid-sentence, The blank stare at my own phone like I couldn't remember how to use it. I was careful about it. I had watched enough family members go through genuine cognitive decline to know what it looked like, and I was careful never to overplay it. It had to be subtle. It had to be the kind of thing a concerned wife would mention to her paralegal brother in a phone call. The kind of thing that would plant a seed. Roy hired a security consultant who installed cameras I could monitor remotely. Voice-activated audio recorders went into the living room, the kitchen, the study, nothing in the bedrooms. I wanted evidence, not invasion. We monitored Nicole's communications through entirely legal channels, things that were available from the paper trail she had already left. We documented everything. And I waited. The invitation was my idea. Christmas at my lake house. Thomas and Nicole would come down from Nashville. Nicole's brother Darren would be there, which was itself unusual since he had only come to the house once before, and that visit had coincided, I now realized, with a period when I had casually mentioned to Nicole that I was reviewing my estate documents. The invitation to Darren was Nicole's suggestion. She brought it up in November like it was the most natural thing in the world. Darren doesn't have anywhere to go this Christmas. Would it be okay if he joined us? I said, of course. The more the merrier. And I sounded like a lonely old man who was grateful for the company, which is exactly what I wanted her to think. The week before Christmas, I called Thomas. This was the hardest part. Because Thomas, whatever Nicole had told him, whatever she had been slowly feeding him over the months, was still my son. He was still the man who had sat with Carol while she was dying. And I needed to look at him on that phone call and not know whether he was complicit or a victim, and treat him exactly the same either way. We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things. His project at work, the weather, whether I wanted him to bring anything for Christmas dinner. His voice was warm and easy, the way it had always been with me. I looked for guilt in it and found nothing certain, which gave me no comfort at all. Roy would be parked down the road on Christmas night. 2 of his investigators would be in the house, one as a cousin I had mentioned to Nicole weeks earlier, casually, a family member visiting for the holidays. The other would be in the upstairs bedroom with recording equipment. Local law enforcement had been briefed. A detective from the Knox County Financial Crimes Unit, a woman named Sergeant Alvarado, had reviewed Roy's files and agreed that if the attempt came, they would have sufficient grounds. I cooked a real Christmas dinner. I wanted everything to look right. Turkey, stuffing, Carol's sweet potato casserole recipe from the index card she had written it on 30 years ago and which still lives in the kitchen drawer. I set the table with the good dishes. I put on the Christmas music she used to love, the old Nat King Cole record, and if I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes longer than I needed to, listening to it, that was between me and Carol. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Thomas came through the door first and hugged me the way he always had, hard and without ceremony. Nicole was behind him in a red coat, Darren just behind her. He was heavier than I remembered, with the kind of easy confidence that belongs to men who have never actually been tested. He shook my hand and told me the house was beautiful. I thanked him and shuffled slightly as I walked to the kitchen, one hand trailing along the wall as if I needed the steadiness. Dinner was good. The turkey was excellent. I watched Nicole watch me through the whole meal. She was attentive in a studied way, refilling my water glass unprompted, steering the conversation gently when I let a sentence trail off and stared out at the snow on the lake. Thomas was quieter than usual. He kept looking at me with something that might have been concern or might have been rehearsed concern. I still could not tell. Darren talked about wine. After dinner, Thomas offered to clean up, and Nicole offered to help him. I sat in the living room with Darren, and for a while we talked about nothing in particular, and I could feel him taking inventory of the room, the way a man takes inventory when he is deciding what things are worth. Then Nicole came in from the kitchen and sat down across from me, her hands folded in her lap, and her voice shifted into the register it goes to when someone has something prepared. "Dad," she said, "there's something we've been wanting to talk to you about." Thomas had followed her in. He stood near the fireplace with his hands in his pockets, and I could not read his face. "Of course," I said, and made my eyes go slightly vague. Nicole glanced at Darren. Something passed between them that they did not know I saw. "We've been worried about you," she said. "Thomas and I both have. the little things. Forgetting the reservation, the mail you forgot to bring in for 2 weeks last month, the scrambled eggs that you left on the burner. She leaned forward slightly. We're not trying to upset you. We love you, but we want to make sure you're protected. I'm fine, I said, and let my voice be slightly uncertain, the way it would be if I were not entirely sure that was true. That's just it, Darren said, leaning forward. He had his professional voice on now, measured and authoritative, the voice he had practiced for 4 years of pretending to be something he was not. Sometimes when these things start, people feel fine. That's actually part of what makes it difficult. The awareness can come and go. He pulled a folder from the bag beside his chair, the kind of moment that had been choreographed and I had been waiting for since October. I've prepared some documents. Nothing complicated. A durable power of attorney. A financial management trust. It just ensures that if there comes a time when you need help, the decisions are in the right hands. People who love you. I looked at the folder. I looked at Thomas. Is this what you want? I asked him. My voice was quiet, genuine. Thomas shifted his weight. He looked at Nicole, then back at me. Dad, we're just trying to help. We want you to be taken care of. There was something in the way he said it that did not belong to him. It sounded like a sentence someone else had written for him. I looked at my son, this man I had raised, and I made a decision that I think Carol would have made too. I decided he was not the enemy. I decided that he was a man who loved his wife and had been listening to her voice in his ear for 2 years, slowly, patiently, redirected, the way water redirects stone. I decided I would give him the chance to be who I knew he actually was. But first, I had to finish what we had started. I looked at the documents Darren had placed on the coffee table. I reached forward and picked them up with a slightly trembling hand. I turned the pages slowly, squinting at them, and I said, I just don't understand all this legal language. I looked up at Darren. If you think it's the right thing, I suppose. I let my voice go small. I just don't want to be a burden. Darren smiled the smile of a man who thinks he has won. That's exactly right, he said. We're just making sure everyone is protected. It's the responsible thing. Nicole was watching me with something that lived just behind her careful expression. I recognized it. It was the same thing I had seen in the kitchen window in October, in the footage from the birdhouse camera. Satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of a plan coming together. I reached for the pen she was already extending toward me, and then I put the pen down. I straightened up in my chair. I set the documents on the coffee table, squared them carefully against the edge, and I looked at each of them in turn. Thomas, Nicole, Darren. When I spoke, my voice was the voice I had used for 42 years when I was closing a deal or ending a meeting that had gone wrong, or telling an employee something they did not want to hear. Clear, unhurried, entirely in control. Roy, I said, did you get all of that? The door to the study opened. Roy Caldwell walked out. Behind him came the man I had introduced as my cousin, who was, in fact, one of Roy's investigators, and behind him came a woman I had not introduced at all because she had been upstairs since noon. Sergeant Alvarado, Knox County Financial Crimes Unit, in plain clothes, holding a recorder with a green light blinking steadily. Darren stood up so fast his knee hit the coffee table. What? Sit down, Sergeant Alvarado said. Not loudly. She did not need to. Nicole's face had gone the color of old snow. She looked at me with something I had not seen from her before. It was not anger, and it was not shame. It was calculation. The rapid recalculation of a person whose model of the situation has just collapsed, trying to find a new position. I watched her look at the recorder. I watched her look at the documents on the table. I watched her decide. This is a misunderstanding, she said. We were trying to help him. Darren is just a friend who understands estate planning. Darren is not a licensed attorney, Roy said, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something. He placed a thin folder on the coffee table. His paralegal certification lapsed in 2021. He has been representing himself as a licensed estate attorney to at least 6 other families in the last 4 years. 3 of those families have already filed complaints with the state bar. Thomas had not moved from the fireplace. He was staring at Darren. Tom. Darren's voice changed. The professional register dropped, and what was underneath was younger and less certain. Tom, listen, this isn't— Don't, Thomas said. One word. Sergeant Alvarado stepped forward. She addressed herself to Darren first. The charges she outlined were clear and specific: practicing law without a license, conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, fraudulent misrepresentation. She read him his rights with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done it many times. He listened with his hands at his sides and a face that had gone completely still, like a man watching the building he thought was solid turn out to be cardboard. Then she turned to Nicole. The charges she outlined for Nicole included conspiracy to defraud an elderly person, abuse of a position of trust, and filing a fraudulent financial instrument, the power of attorney document Darren had prepared, which contained a false representation of Darren's credentials. Nicole said nothing. She looked at me, and for 1 second, just one, I saw what was underneath all of it. It was not malice exactly, though it was that too. It was something colder. The look of a person who had placed a very large bet on a very specific outcome and had been wrong. Nicole, Thomas said. His voice was so quiet I almost could not hear it. How long? She looked at her husband. Whatever she saw in his face, she chose not to answer. Roy pressed a button on the tablet in his hand. The television in the corner of the room came on. It was footage from Nicole's car, taken 3 weeks earlier. A conversation she had with Darren on the phone, the audio pulled from her Bluetooth through means that Roy's investigator could explain in court, but that I did not need explained to me. I had already watched it 4 times. The recording was 7 minutes long. In it, Nicole laid out the timeline. The plan to establish a pattern of cognitive decline. The plan to use Christmas as the moment because I would be emotionally off balance, because the house was remote, because the holidays created an atmosphere in which family pressure felt normal. She mentioned the figure they expected to access first, $3 million, in a private investment vehicle that Darren had prepared the documentation for, structured in a way that would be difficult to trace quickly. She mentioned Thomas in a way that made my hands tighten on the arm of my chair, not because she expressed love for him, but because she expressed something else entirely: usefulness. She described my son as the access point, the key, the one whose name on a joint account opened the right doors. She did not say that she would leave him when it was done. She did not need to. The absence of his name in any future she described said it clearly enough. When the recording ended, the room was silent except for the Nat King Cole record, which had been playing quietly all along and which no one had thought to turn off. It seemed impossible to me, in that moment, that the world could be that particular kind of absurd, that the song Carol loved could be playing in the background of this. The officers came through the front door at my signal. There were 2 of them. They were professional and quiet about it. Darren went without resistance, all the bluster entirely gone. Just a middle-aged man who had been pretending to be something he wasn't and had run out of room to keep pretending. Nicole went without speaking, which was, in its own way, more frightening than anything she might have said. Thomas stood at the fireplace and watched them go. I sat with my son for a long time after the cars left. The investigators were packing up their equipment in the other rooms. Roy was on the phone in the kitchen. Outside, the snow had kept falling. The lake was dark, and the lights on the dock made long reflections in the water the way they always did in winter, the way they had every Christmas I could remember in this house. Thomas sat across from me in the chair where Darren had been, and for a while neither of us said anything. Then he said, "Did you know from the beginning?" "From August," I said. "About Nicole's investors." The rest came later. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't know about Darren. I mean, I knew he wasn't practicing actively, but she told me he was just between firms. I didn't know about the documents. He paused. I knew something was wrong. I felt it. "I just didn't," he stopped. "You loved her," I said. "Yes," he said. I thought about what to say. I had been thinking about it since August, since the moment Roy laid those documents on my kitchen table, since I understood that whatever happened here, my son was going to be sitting across from me in some version of this conversation, and I was going to have to find the right words for it. Your mother knew, I said. She told me to keep my eyes open. I wish I had listened sooner. Thomas looked up. The way she looked at you, I said. Even in those last weeks, the way she looked at you made her happy in a way that very few things did. She wasn't worried about your judgment. She was worried about your heart. She knew how much you needed to believe the best about the people you loved, and she knew that was the thing that could be used against you. I leaned forward. That is not a weakness, Thomas. That is who you are. It is not your fault that someone chose to use it. He put his face in his hands. He was not crying exactly. He was doing something quieter than that. The thing men do when they are holding something very large and finally, have permission to put it down. I reached over and put my hand on his shoulder. We sat there for a long time. The legal proceedings lasted 7 months. Roy had assembled a file that was, as he put it, excessive in the best possible way. The audio recordings from my house, the footage from Nicole's car, the documents Darren had prepared, the testimony from 3 of the other families he had defrauded, the paper trail connecting Nicole to the fraudulent investment scheme that the Tennessee Securities Division had been building a case against for 18 months. The prosecutors were not lacking for material. Darren took a plea agreement. He agreed to testify fully against Nicole in exchange for a reduced sentence. He got 4 years, the revocation of any professional credentials, and a civil liability judgment in favor of the families he had defrauded that would follow him for the rest of his working life. Nicole went to trial. Her attorney was competent and worked hard, but there is a limited amount of work you can do when the client's own voice, in her own words, in her own car, has laid out the entire plan, with the thoroughness of a project manager preparing for a board meeting. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts on 3 counts, including the most serious, financial elder abuse, which under Tennessee law carried significant sentencing weight given the premeditation involved and the vulnerability of the intended victim. The judge gave her 9 years. I was in the courtroom for the verdict. Thomas was not. He had asked me whether I thought he should come, and I had told him that was a decision only he could make, and that I would support him either way. He chose not to come. He told me he needed it to be over, and that watching it in person would make it harder for it to be over. I understood that completely. When the foreman read the verdict, I looked at Nicole. She was sitting very still. She had been very still through most of the trial, controlled and precise in the way she was controlled and precise about everything. When she heard the word guilty, something changed in her face. Not dramatically. It was a very small change. The particular change of a person who has, for the first time, genuinely run out of options. I had seen that face before in business. In negotiations that had gone irretrievably wrong, it is not a face that inspires triumph. It mostly inspires exhaustion. I drove home through the spring afternoon with Roy in the passenger seat, and I thought about Carol, and I thought about the company I had spent 42 years building, and then let go, and I thought about what I wanted the remaining years of my life to actually be about. Thomas and I talked every day for the first month after the verdict. Then, every few days. Then, gradually, in the natural rhythm of a father and son who have always been close and have now been through something together that neither of them will ever fully forget. He filed for divorce 3 weeks after the guilty verdict. He is doing what I did after Carol died, which is to say he is getting through it, one day at a time, in the unglamorous and necessary way that grief actually works, without shortcuts and without the luxury of speed. He came down to the lake house in June for 2 weeks. We fished in the mornings and watched old baseball games in the evenings and ate very simple meals on the back porch. We did not talk about Nicole or Darren or the trial. We talked about the company, about the early years, about projects Thomas had worked on, about the deer that kept getting into the garden. One afternoon, he caught a bass that was genuinely impressive, and we stood there in the boat, arguing about whether it was large enough to keep, the way we have always argued about that, and then he threw it back the way he always does, and I complained about it the way I always do, and for a little while, the lake was just a lake, and the summer was just summer. Roy and I started working on something in the fall. The original idea was simpler than what it became. I had money I needed to do something meaningful with. Roy knew 3 other attorneys in the state who had handled similar cases. Families targeted through fraudulent estate planning schemes, elderly people pressured into handing over assets or signing documents that stripped them of their autonomy. There were more of them than I had understood before this happened to me. Far more. We incorporated the Greer Family Trust, which was a clumsy name, and we eventually changed it to something better, Second Chance Legal Fund. The model was straightforward. We provided, at no cost, 2 things that the families in these situations almost never had access to. First, genuinely qualified legal representation, because the investigators who worked on elder financial fraud cases consistently found that the victims did not have attorneys who specialized in this area and did not know how to find them. Second, investigative support, because the schemes were almost always more sophisticated than they appeared, and unraveling them required time and expertise that most families simply could not afford. Roy came on as executive director, which I want to be clear was his idea and not mine, and which required me to spend 3 separate lunches convincing him that a nonprofit was not professional exile. He is, I think, the best possible person to run it, because he approaches it with the same methodical thoroughness that he brought to building my defense, and because he has the particular patience required to sit across from a frightened family and make them believe that the situation is manageable. Thomas volunteers on weekends when he can. He is not a lawyer, but he has a gift for the intake conversations, the first calls, the moments when a family is trying to decide whether what they suspect is real or whether they are making a terrible accusation against someone they love. He knows what that uncertainty feels like from the inside. He communicates it in a way that no amount of professional training could replicate. Several of our clients have told me specifically that talking to Thomas was the reason they decided to come forward. Last month, I was reviewing case files on a Thursday afternoon when Roy knocked on my office door and said there was a family in the lobby who had come without an appointment. An older woman and 2 adult children, he said. The mother was 72, had sold her florist business the previous year after 40 years, and was being pressured by her son-in-law and his brother to sign over an investment trust. Sound familiar, he said. I went out to meet them. The mother's name was Dorothy. She was a small woman with white hair and a straight spine, and the hands of someone who had spent 4 decades arranging flowers, which is to say strong and careful and exactly the right size for what they needed to do. She looked at me with very steady eyes and said that her family told her she was being paranoid, that she was misremembering things, that the confusion she sometimes felt was getting worse, and she needed to let people help her. I sat down across from her. "Are you confused?" I asked. She looked at me for a moment. "No," she said. "Do you trust your memory?" "Mostly," she said. "Do you believe something is wrong with what they're asking you to sign?" "Yes," she said. No hesitation. "Then you're not paranoid," I said. "You're paying attention." She looked at her children, then back at me. Something in her face shifted, the particular release of a person who has been carrying a weight alone and has just, finally, been given permission to set it down. "Can you help me?" she asked. I told her yes. I meant it completely. Roy's team started on her case that afternoon. 3 weeks later, we had enough to bring to the district attorney's office. The son-in-law's brother was, as it turned out, operating the same kind of ghost attorney scheme that Darren had run. Different state, different name, same playbook. He is currently facing charges in 2 jurisdictions. Dorothy called me last week to say that she had planted her spring bulbs and was already thinking about what she wanted the garden to look like by Easter. She sounded like a woman who had come back to herself after a long absence. I know what that sounds like because I heard it in Thomas's voice, and in my own, in the months after the trial. I think about Nicole sometimes, less than I used to. When I do, I don't feel what I expected to feel. I had expected contempt, or the particular cold satisfaction of a man who was right. But mostly what I feel is something more like sadness, the kind of sadness you feel when you see something that could have been different and wasn't. She was an intelligent person. She had organizational ability and nerve, and the kind of long-range patience that, in another context, might have built something real. She decided to use it to take what didn't belong to her, and she is serving 9 years for that decision. And I do not think there is any satisfaction in that. Certainly not enough to stay with for very long. What I stay with is the lake in the evening, the sound of the dock against the water, the index card in the kitchen drawer with Carol's handwriting on it, slightly faded now, the sweet potato casserole recipe that I have made every Christmas since she died, and that I will make every Christmas I have left, because some things are worth continuing. What I stay with is Thomas, his voice on the phone, gradually finding its way back to the ease it used to have. Not all the way back yet, but further every month. What I stay with is Dorothy's voice, telling me about the spring bulbs, and the look on Roy's face on the days when a case goes right, and the particular satisfaction, different from triumph and better than it, of work that actually matters. I spent 42 years learning that a business is only as strong as what it is built on. After Carol died, after the company sold, I thought that lesson had already taught me everything it had to teach. I was wrong. There was one more thing, the most important thing. What you build is only worth what you choose to do with it. I am 69 years old. I run a foundation that gives frightened old people their lives back. Every morning I wake up in the house Carol and I built together, look out at the lake, drink my coffee, and then go do something that matters. I smile when I think about Nicole standing in my kitchen window all those months ago, watching me shuffle down the driveway in my bathrobe, holding her coffee mug, satisfied. She thought she was watching an old man falling apart. She was watching a man getting to work. If you are someone who suspects that a family member is trying to take advantage of you, or someone you love, I want you to know that the instinct to doubt yourself, to think that you are being paranoid, to wonder whether accusing someone you love makes you the problem, that instinct is exactly what these people count on. It is their most important tool. The moment you start to trust your own judgment again, they have already lost. Trust your judgment. Keep your eyes open. And remember, the wolves are always watching, but so is the man they decided was too old to be worth worrying about. He is taking very good notes.